The mansion was located atop a wooded hill on the outskirts of Hudson Valley in the state of New York. It was an imposing late 19th century building with stone columns darkened by time, tall windows, and an iron gate that creaked whenever the wind swept across the dirt road. For decades, locals passed by with averted glances. It wasn't just the size of the property that was striking, it was the silence. The Whitmore family had lived in that mansion for generations. They were known for their long-standing wealth, industrial heritage, and properties scattered throughout the country. In local newspapers, the Whitmore name only appeared in connection with charitable or business events. But among the older residents of the region, there was a different kind of conversation, whispered conversations. They said something was going on inside that mansion, something that never reached the authorities, something the family always managed to hide. Clara Bennett didn't believe in small-town stories. She was 32 years old and worked as a restorer of old documents for libraries and museums. When she received the offer to catalogue the Whitmore family's historical archives, she saw it as a rare opportunity. The task seemed simple: to organize letters, records, and documents accumulated over generations within the mansion. The pay was generous, and the contract made one condition clear: she should work inside the property. When Clara first arrived at the gate on a grey autumn afternoon, she felt something strange. The silence seemed heavier there. Ancient trees surrounded the hill, as if forming a natural wall. The wind passed through the dry branches, producing a low sound, almost like a distant murmur. The gate opened slowly. On the other side was Arthur Whitmore, the current patriarch of the family. He was a tall, elegant man with perfectly combed grey hair. His smile was polite, but distant. "Miss Bennett," he said calmly, "we were expecting your arrival." Clara shook his hand. Something about that tight space felt too cold. The interior of the mansion was even more impressive. Long runners, antique carpets, paintings of ancestors observing every movement. But what really caught the eye was the state of some parts of the house. While some rooms were immaculate, others looked like they had been forgotten for decades. Doors closed, darkened corridors, stairs leading to wings where no one seemed to enter. Arthur explained quickly, "Some areas of the house are not part of the work." Clara simply nodded. The files were in an old library on the second floor. Hundreds of boxes, documents over 100 years old, personal letters, medical records, old receipts, entire stories preserved on aged paper. It was the kind of work that Clara loved. But on the first night, something happened. She was organizing letters from 1924 when she heard the sound. A whisper, very low. It seemed to come from the hallway. Clara raised her head. The hallway was empty. The old lights flickered faintly. She went back to work. Minutes later, he heard it again. A drawn-out sound, like someone talking behind a wall. She opened the library door and looked down the hallway. Nothing, just the long rug and old portraits on the walls. But just as he was about to close the door, he heard something clearer. One sentence, low, almost inaudible. "Don't tell—" Clara froze. The sound seemed to be coming from the end of the hallway. But when she walked over there, she found only an old door locked with a rusty key. The following morning, during breakfast, Clara mentioned what had happened. Arthur Whitmore did not seem surprised. He simply placed the cup on the table and replied calmly, "Old houses make noises." But before Clara could say anything, another voice joined the conversation. Era Margaret Whitmore, Arthur's sister. She looked directly at Clara. And he said something that caused silence to fill the room. "There are things in this house that should not be investigated." Arthur gave her a stern look. Margaret fell silent. But at that moment Clara realized something. They weren't bothered by what she heard. They were worried about the fact that she listened. That same night, as she walked down the hall back to her room, Clara heard the whispers again. This time there were several, many, low, mixed, like voices trapped behind walls. She stopped in the middle of the hallway. The sound seemed to be coming from inside the mansion, not from the outside, not from the wind, but from somewhere hidden within the very structure of the house. And then she noticed something that made her shudder. In several portraits of the Whitmore family, some faces had been removed from photographs, as if certain people had been erased from history. And at that moment, Clara had a thought that she couldn't ignore. Perhaps her job there wasn't just to organize documents. Perhaps she was about to find out, something that family spent decades trying to hide. And perhaps the whispers weren't just household noises. Perhaps they were voices that nobody ever wanted to hear. The following morning, the mansion seemed even larger than Clara had realized on the first day. The pale autumn light streamed through the tall windows of the main hallway, casting long shadows on the dark wooden floor. The silence hung heavy, as if each wall absorbed any sound before it could even echo. Clara walked slowly through the house, memorizing the paths between the corridors. With so many rooms, staircases, and closed doors, it was easy to get lost there. The architecture of the place clearly reflected the Whitmore family's former wealth. The mansion had been built in the late 19th century, during the height of American industrialization, when influential families amassed fortunes through railroads, mining, and factories. And the Whitmores were among those families. Based on the letters and records that Clara had begun to organize, the original patriarch, Edward Whitmore, he had been the owner of a powerful railroad company in the northeastern United States. His name appeared in old newspapers, contracts, and correspondence with important politicians of the time. But there was something strange. After the 1930s, many records simply disappeared. Some documents appeared to have been removed intentionally. Others had pages torn out. It was as if certain events had been erased from the family's own history. Clara realized that it wasn't just the documentation that was hiding gaps. The house itself seemed to hide secrets. While exploring one of the side corridors on the second floor, he came across a row of old portraits. They were paintings and photographs of the Whitmore family throughout the generations. Men in dark suits, women in elegant dresses, children with rigid expressions. But in some paintings there was something disturbing. In at least 4 portraits, one of the faces had been removed. It wasn't natural wear and tear. Someone had carefully cut out those parts of the image. The rest of the photograph remained intact. Clara ran her fingers along the frame of one of them. The caption below simply said, "The Whitmore Family, 1912." But there was an empty space between 2 people, as if someone had ever existed there, and then it had been deleted. During lunch that day, Clara had the chance to get a closer look at the family members who still lived in the mansion. Arthur Whitmore naturally occupied the center of decision-making. His posture was always controlled, his words measured, and his presence seemed to impose invisible rules within the house. Beside her was her sister, Margaret Whitmore. Unlike Arthur, Margaret seemed to carry a constant restlessness. Her eyes observed everything attentively, as if she were always expecting something unexpected to happen. There was also a third resident, Daniel Whitmore, son of Arthur. Daniel was about 26 years old. He was quieter than the other 2. During lunch he hardly spoke, limiting himself to answering short questions when Clara tried to start a conversation. But Clara noticed something curious. Daniel seemed to avoid looking directly into the hallways of the house, primarily towards the side, leading to the old wing of the mansion. After lunch, Clara returned to the library. While organizing boxes of files from the 1940s, he found something different, a thick envelope. No identification. Inside were old medical records. They did not belong to any known hospital in the region. The documents described psychological assessments, but the patients' names were crossed out with black ink. Some sentences could still be read. The patient presents with recurrent episodes of auditory delirium. He claims to hear voices inside the residence. Isolation is recommended to avoid public exposure. Clara frowned. All the reports had the same address noted at the top of the page, Whitmore Mansion itself. That night, Clara decided to take a closer look at the house. She quietly left the room and walked down the hallway, lit only by a few old lamps. The whispers returned, this time closer than ever. Clearer. It was impossible to understand complete words, but the tone was unmistakable. Human voices, lows, as if they were trying to speak without being heard. Clara followed the sound. The hallway always seemed to lead her to the same place, the oldest wing of the house. A part of the mansion that Arthur had clearly stated was not part of the job. At the end of that corridor was a large, dark wooden door, unlike the others, heavier and locked. Clara approached slowly. When he placed his hand on the doorknob, the whispering stopped immediately. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. She tried to turn the doorknob, locked, but something caught his attention. On the floor, very close to the door, there were old scratch marks on the wood, as if something had been dragged around repeatedly. Suddenly, a voice behind her broke the silence. "I told you that certain parts of the house are not part of your job." Clara turned around quickly. Arthur Whitmore was standing at the beginning of the hallway. His eyes were fixed on her, but this time his face lacked the polite smile it had before. There was something harsher in his expression. "It's colder. The East Wing has been closed for decades," he said slowly. Clara tried to remain calm. "I just heard a noise." Arthur walked a few steps towards her. "Old houses make noise," he replied again. But before leaving, he added something that made Clara feel a shiver run down her spine. "And sometimes, silence exists for a reason." That night, Clara returned to her room with a growing certainty. The Whitmores weren't just hiding something. They were protecting a secret too old to be revealed. And the more she investigated the family archives, the more she realized that the history of that mansion was not just made of wealth and tradition. It was made of absences. People who disappeared from the records, altered photographs, hidden medical reports, and voices. Voices continued to whisper in the mansion's corridors, as if still trying to tell a story that had never been allowed to come to light. In the following days, Clara tried to focus solely on her work. That's what any sensible person would do, cataloging documents, organizing letters, and ignoring the strange sounds of the house, ignoring the forbidden corridors, ignoring the silent stares of the Whitmore family. But the further she delved into the files, the harder it became to pretend that all of this was normal. There were too many gaps, interrupted stories, people who simply disappeared from the family timeline. And whenever that happened, the records always ended the same way. Silence. On her fourth night inside the mansion, Clara found something that completely changed her perception of the story. It was an old diary, bound in darkened leather. The cover was marked with only 1 year, 1934. The pages were yellowed and fragile. The handwriting was irregular, as if the writer was always nervous or in a hurry. Clara began to read. The first pages talked about the daily routine of the house, formal dinners, family gatherings, and visits from important figures in the city. But as the pages turned, the tone changed. The sentences were getting shorter, more restless. On one of the pages, a phrase was highlighted several times. "They say there's nothing behind the walls, but I hear it every night." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. She continued reading. The voices are louder now. Sometimes they seem to be asking for help. "Edward says it's imagination." But Margaret heard it too. They ordered the East Wing to be locked down again. Clara slowly closed the diary. It was the same place that Arthur had forbidden, and alas, alas, the same door where she had heard the whispers, the same door with scratch marks on the floor. That night, Clara decided to pay closer attention to the movements inside the house. She realized that the Whitmores followed very specific routines. Arthur spent a good part of the day in an office on the ground floor. Margaret rarely left the second floor. And Daniel disappeared almost every night after 10 o'clock. always down the same corridor, always in the direction of the East Wing. On the sixth night, Clara decided to follow him. She waited until she heard his footsteps in the hallway. When Daniel walked through her bedroom door, Clara quietly stepped out and began walking behind him. The hallway was almost dark. Only a few old lamps illuminated the path. Daniel was walking fast, like someone used to doing that without being seen. He reached the heavy door of the East Wing. He glanced quickly to both sides, and then he took a key out of his pocket. The sound of the lock turning echoed through the silent hallway. Daniel entered, and she closed the door behind him. Clara stood still for a few seconds. My heart was pounding. She knew she shouldn't do that, but he also knew that this might be the only chance to find out what was really going on. She approached the door. He pressed his ear against the wood. In the beginning, there was only silence. Then the sound returned, the voices, lots of, whispering at the same time. Some seemed to be crying, others are desperate. But there was something even more disturbing. Between the whispers, Clara heard something metallic, like chains being dragged along, or iron doors being closed. Suddenly, a loud sound echoed from inside, a scream, low, muffled, but unmistakably human. Clara immediately stepped back from the door, his stomach clenched. That wasn't my imagination. It wasn't just the noises of an old house. There was somebody wings inside. Moments later, the door opened. Daniel left. When he saw Clara in the hallway, he froze. For a few seconds, neither of them said anything. His face was pale. His eyes showed something between fear and exhaustion. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally. Clara took a deep breath. "I heard someone scream." Daniel ran his hand through his hair, visibly nervous. "You need to forget about that." "There's someone inside." He glanced quickly at the door behind him. Then he looked back at Clara. His voice came out almost in a whisper. "Some things cannot leave this house." Before Clara could answer, a third voice echoed down the hallway. "Daniel." Arthur Whitmore was standing at the other end of the corridor. His presence seemed to fill the entire space. He watched the two of them with a stern expression. "I figured I'd find you here." Daniel lowered his head immediately, like someone who had been caught breaking a very old rule. Arthur walked over to them. His gaze turned to Clara. "Miss Bennet," he said calmly, "I think we need to clarify something." He slowly pointed to the door of the East Wing. "What's inside is a matter exclusively for the Whitmore family." Clara felt the weight of those words. But then she asked the question she could no longer keep to herself. "Is someone being held captive there?" The silence that followed was suffocating. Arthur looked directly into her eyes, and he responded with utter coldness. "There are things in this house that have been here for generations." He took a step closer. "And some of them, they cannot be released." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. Arthur's words echoed in his mind. "They cannot be released." That didn't sound like superstition. It sounded like prison. And the more she thought about the altered documents, diaries, and photographs, the more a disturbing idea began to form. Perhaps the Whitmore family wasn't just hiding a secret. Perhaps they were keeping something trapped inside that mansion for decades, and the whispers that echoed in the hallways. Perhaps they were the voices of people who never managed to leave. After the night in the East Wing hallway, the behavior inside the mansion changed in a subtle but noticeable way. No one directly mentioned what had happened, but the silence in the house seemed even heavier. Arthur Whitmore began appearing more frequently at the library where Clara worked. He said nothing, simply walked among the shelves, observed the documents being organized, and then slowly left, as if evaluating every detail of her work. Margaret, on the other hand, seemed increasingly restless. Sometimes Clara found her standing by the second-floor windows, gazing at the hill covered in bare trees. Other times she would walk the hallways at night, like someone who couldn't sleep. And Daniel avoided Clara completely. After the incident at the East Wing door, he practically disappeared from the household routine. Meanwhile, the files continued to reveal strange fragments of the family's history. Clara had begun organizing documents from the 1950s when she found a box that was different from the others. She was locked in, but the lock was rusty and gave way easily when Clara forced the lid. Inside, there were photographs, many photographs, but none of them showed the main members of the family. They were photos of unknown people, men, women, some children. Everyone was inside the mansion, in several different rooms. But what caught Clara's attention was something else. In all the images, those people looked uncomfortable. Some were sitting in simple chairs, looking directly at the camera with tense expressions. Others were in the hallways of the house, always accompanied by someone from the Whitmore family in the background, observing. There were notes on the back of some of the photographs, dates, and small handwritten notes. Patient 4, aggressive behavior. Patient 7 reports hearing voices in the hallways. Patient 12, isolation recommended. Clara felt her stomach tighten. It looked much less like a family album, and much more with improvised clinical record. That same afternoon, Clara met Daniel in the mansion's garden. He was sitting on a stone bench near the old trees on the property. He looked exhausted. Clara hesitated for a few seconds, but decided to approach. "Daniel," she said calmly. He slowly raised his eyes. For a few moments he remained silent. Then he spoke in a low voice. "You should leave." Clara sat down on the bench next to him. "I found photographs," she said, "of people who aren't family." Daniel closed his eyes for a few seconds. "I knew you'd find it eventually." The wind swept through the trees, scattering dry leaves across the ground. Clara waited. Then he asked, "Who were these people?" Daniel took a few seconds before answering. "People who came seeking help." Clara frowned. "Help?" He nodded slowly. Decades ago, the Whitmores had a strange reputation in the region. He took a deep breath. Some people believed that certain family members had abilities. Clara looked at him, confused. Daniel continued. "They said they could identify disturbed people, people who heard things, who had dangerous behaviors." He paused. "Desperate families brought relatives here." Clara felt a shiver. "You mean they were treated here?" Daniel let out a small, bitter laugh. "Treaties is a kind word." That night, Clara returned to the archives with a different perspective. Now everything seemed to make more sense. The medical reports, the photographs, gaps in family records. She started putting together a timeline. Between the 1920s and 1960s, several people were taken to Whitmore Manor. But none of them appeared in the departure records. There were no transfer documents, not even hospital records, not even high school diplomas. It was as if those people simply disappeared. While Clara was analyzing these documents, Margaret appeared at the library door. She entered slowly. He closed the door behind him, and he walked over to the table where Clara was sitting. For a few seconds, he simply observed the scattered photographs. Then he spoke in a low voice. "You found more than you should have." Clara looked up. "Were these people imprisoned here?" Margaret took a while to reply. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded heavy with years of burden. "In the beginning, everyone believed it was to help." She picked up one of the photographs. It was a young woman sitting in a chair in the hallway of the mansion. Some of these people were really sick. Margaret placed the photograph back on the table. "But others..." She didn't finish the sentence. Clara asked, "What happened to them?" Margaret remained silent for a few seconds. Then he said something that made Clara's heart race. "Some have never left the house." Before Clara could ask another question, Margaret approached the table and spoke in a lower tone, almost a whisper. "Do you think the voices you hear in the hallways are ghosts?" Clara did not answer. Margaret continued, "They are not." She pointed slowly towards the east wing of the house. "That's not just an old hallway." She took a deep breath. "This is where my grandfather had the isolation rooms built." Silence fell over the library. Margaret then completed the sentence that Clara would never forget. And some of those rooms, they were never opened again. That night, as Clara walked down the hall to return to her room, she noticed something even more unsettling. The whispers were getting louder, closer, and this time she managed to distinguish some words, different voices, mixed. But they all repeated something similar, one sentence, always the same: "We're still here." That night, Clara could no longer ignore the whispers. They were taller than ever. They were no longer just indistinct murmurs as before. Now they sounded like real voices trying to pierce through the walls of the mansion. Some sounded weak, almost like distant echoes. Others carried despair, and they all seemed to come from the same direction. And alas, Clara remained seated on the bed for several minutes, trying to convince herself that this was merely a result of the tension from the last few days. But then she heard something different. A metallic sound. A dry impact, like someone knocking on an iron door. The decision came about almost without her realizing it. She needed to see what was there. The hallway was dark when Clara left the room. The mansion seemed even quieter at that hour of the morning. The wind blew outside, making the old trees brush against the walls of the house. Each of her steps on the carpet seemed too high, but the whispers continued, guiding her. She walked down the main hallway, turned into the side wing, and proceeded to the large, dark wooden door that led to the forbidden part of the house. The door was locked, like always. Clara stared at the lock for a few seconds. Then he remembered something. In the library office, there was a small box with old keys that she had catalogued the previous day. Many of them were unmarked. Some were large and old, like those used in old doors. A few minutes later, Clara returned to the hallway with 3 different keys. Her heart pounded as she tested the first one. Nothing. The second one turned partially, but then locked up. When he tried the third time, the lock made a loud clicking sound. The door opened slowly. The air that came from the other side was cold, and it's filled with an old smell, mold, rust, and something else that's harder to identify. Clara picked up a small flashlight she had brought with her. The hallway in the east wing was completely different from the rest of the house. The walls were made of exposed stone. There was no lighting. The floor was made of old concrete. It looked less like a residential hallway and more like a space built for a different purpose. Something more functional, more isolated. As she walked, the whispers grew clearer. They were not imaginary voices. They were human voices. Fracas, lows. Some seemed to come from behind the walls, others with closed doors along the corridor. Clara shone her flashlight on one of them. It was an iron door, with a small grated opening in the center, like the doors of old prison cells. Her heart raced. She slowly approached the first door. The grated opening was rusty, but it still allowed a view of the interior. Clara brought the flashlight closer. The room was small, just stone walls, a rusty iron bed fastened to the floor, and chains attached to the wall. But it was empty. She walked to the next door, another room, also empty. But in the third quarter, something made Clara hold her breath. There were marks on the walls, deep scratches, as if someone had been trying to scrape the stone with their bare hands for years. The hallway seemed endless. Door after door, room after room. Some are empty. Others with antique furniture, some containing extremely old medical objects. And then Clara reached the end of the hallway. There was a door there that was different from the others, heavier, with 2 locks, and something that appeared to have been installed long after the original construction. A modern lock. When Clara held the flashlight close to the small grate on the door, something moved in the dark. She froze. For a few seconds, there was no movement. Then 2 eyes appeared in the darkness. Human eyes, scared. The voice that came from within was hoarse, as if it hadn't been used in a long time. "You are not family." Clara felt her heart stop for a moment. "Is anyone in there?" she asked, almost voicelessly. The figure slowly approached the fence. He was a man, too skinny, long beard, disheveled hair, but clearly alive. Very much alive. "You need to leave," he said urgently. "If they find out you opened that door—" Before Clara could answer, footsteps echoed down the hallway behind her. Boards, firms. She turned the flashlight on. Arthur Whitmore was standing in the doorway of the hallway, but he was not alone. Daniel was standing beside him, and Margaret too. The three of them watched Clara in silence. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. Then Arthur began to walk slowly towards her. When he stopped in front of the door, he looked at the man inside the cell. And then he turned his gaze to Clara. "I was afraid this would happen." Clara tried to speak, but the words came out jumbled. "He's alive. You're keeping someone prisoner here." Arthur sighed slowly, like someone tired of hiding something for too long. "Miss Bennet," he said calmly, "what you've just discovered is the reason this house exists." Clara looked again at the man behind the door. He watched Arthur with a look full of hatred. Arthur then said something that completely changed Clara's understanding of everything. These rooms were never built to house sick people. He pointed to the man behind the door. They were built to maintain certain dangerous people far from the world. The man inside the cell started laughing, a weak laugh, but full of contempt, and then he said something that made Clara's blood run cold. "He still believes that lie." Arthur didn't react. The man continued. "The truth is much worse than she imagines." The silence that followed seemed to crush the entire hallway. Clara realized at that moment that the Whitmore family's secret was much bigger than past arrests or illegal treatments. There was something there, something that had been hidden for generations, and now she was at the center of this secret. The silence in the East Wing hallway lasted for several seconds. The dim light of Clara's lantern partially illuminated the face of the man trapped behind the iron door. His eyes were fixed on Arthur Whitmore with an intense mixture of contempt and weariness. Arthur, on the other hand, seemed strangely calm, like someone who had been expecting that moment to come. Clara was still trying to process what she was seeing. A living man, trapped inside the mansion, in a hidden cell. "How long has he been here?" Clara asked, her voice trembling. Arthur did not respond immediately. He walked a few steps down the hallway, observing the old iron doors around him, as if he were revisiting a part of the house he knew all too well. Finally, he said, "Enough time for the outside world to forget about him." Clara felt a weight on her chest. "This is illegal. You can't just keep someone locked up here." Before Arthur could answer, the man behind the door spoke again. "He can," she said bitterly, "because nobody believes me." Arthur closed his eyes for a moment, clearly bothered. Daniel remained standing a few meters behind, avoiding looking directly at the cell. Margaret seemed more restless than ever. Clara looked at the man again. "Who are you?" He took a few seconds before replying, as if choosing those words was difficult. "My name is Samuel Carter." The name meant nothing to Clara, but the Whitmore family's reaction was immediate. Daniel raised his head. Margaret held her breath. Arthur remained completely still, Samuel realized, and she smiled slightly. "See," he said to Clara, "they still hate hearing my name." Arthur then stepped forward. His voice came out firm, but now it carried something different. Tiredness. "Samuel Carter is not a victim." Clara looked from one to the other. Arthur continued. 25 years ago, he destroyed the lives of many people in this region." Samuel let out a small, hoarse laugh. "That's the version he tells." Arthur ignored it. "He manipulated vulnerable families. He convinced people that he could help them hear things, feel things, speak with voices." Clara frowned. "Like a religious leader?" Arthur shook his head. "Much worse." Samuel spoke again, angrily. "I wasn't manipulating anyone." Arthur finally lost some of his composure. "You were exploiting people who were suffering. The echo of his voice traveled down the stone corridor. Samuel glared at Arthur with hatred. I was showing the truth. Clara felt that something was missing from that story, something that neither of them was saying clearly. "What really happened?" she asked. Margaret finally spoke. His voice was low but firm. "Samuel started bringing people here." Clara looked at her. Margaret continued. "He said the house had something special, that some people could hear things that others couldn't." Clara immediately remembered the medical reports, from the photographs, of the patients. Margaret took a deep breath. Some of these people were really sick, others were simply desperate. She looked at the long row of iron doors, and then the problems began. Daniel finally decided to speak. He seemed nervous. Some people started disappearing. Clara felt her stomach tighten. "Disappear?" Daniel nodded. "Samuel said that they had left." Samuel laughed again. "Because they were." Arthur interrupted firmly. "No!" He looked directly at Clara. "Some of them died here." The hallway fell completely silent. Clara felt the weight of those words. "Dead? How?" Arthur answered, without hesitation. "Crises, violence, mental breakdowns." Samuel spoke in a cold tone. "Or perhaps because you didn't know how to deal with what was happening." Arthur turned sharply toward the cell. "It seems." Samuel moved closer to the fence. His eyes were intense now. "You never wanted to understand." He slowly pointed towards the walls of the hallway. "The people who came here weren't crazy." Clara felt her heart race. Samuel continued, "They heard the same voices you hear now." Clara froze. Arthur stood motionless. Samuel then looked directly at Clara. "You listen too, don't you?" The silence grew heavy. Clara did not answer, but the expression on his face was answer enough. Samuel smiled slightly. "I knew." Arthur took a deep breath, like someone who had just had their worst fear confirmed. He turned to Clara. "That's exactly how it starts." Samuel laughed again. "No, Arthur." He spoke slowly. "That's exactly how it is. The truth comes out." Clara realized at that moment that the situation was much more complex than it seemed. That was not just an illegal arrest. It was an old story, a dispute between two versions of reality. Arthur believed that Samuel was a dangerous manipulator. Samuel claimed he was trying to reveal something real, and amidst all of that were the voices that Clara continued to hear in the hallways. Voices that no one could explain. Samuel then said something that completely changed the atmosphere in the hallway. "Ask him why I'm the only one imprisoned here." Clara looked at Arthur. Samuel continued, "Ask why the other rooms were sealed off." He smiled in a disturbing way. "Because some people, they never left." Arthur slowly closed his eyes, like someone who had carried that secret for decades. Clara felt a shiver run through her entire body, because at that moment the whispers returned, higher, closer, echoing through the walls of the East Wing, and this time it seemed impossible to deny. The voices weren't just inside someone's head, they were inside one's own home. After the night of revelations in the East Wing, Clara felt she could no longer simply observe. The fear remained, but something inside her propelled her forward, the need to understand the truth, even if that truth was terrifying. The following morning, she decided to investigate the family's documents and diaries more thoroughly. She spent hours cross-referencing information between medical reports, old photographs, and the letters that had been hidden. She began to notice patterns. People taken to the mansion were never random. They all had a connection, direct or indirect, to mysterious events in the region, unsolved deaths, or disappearances that were never reported. While working, Clara developed a different routine. Instead of avoiding the dark corridors, she began walking through them, paying close attention to whispers, trying to decipher any sound patterns or direction of the voices. Gradually, she realized that each old corridor of the mansion seemed to have its own energy, almost as if each space held memories of what had happened there. Clara's relationship with Daniel changed during this period. He, who had previously avoided her, began to share fragments of information, not about what the family had done, but about what Samuel truly represented to them. Daniel revealed that despite everything seeming illegal and cruel, Arthur believed he was protecting the world from something Samuel could unleash if given permission. Daniel admitted that he grew up witnessing the conflict between two truths within the mansion: the family's need for control and Samuel's obsession with exposing what he considered real. Margaret also approached, not to protect the family, but to guide Clara. She explained that what the young woman felt in the corridors, the voices, the whispers, the chilling murmurs, was a consequence of Samuel having touched upon a layer of reality that the family had never been able to fully comprehend. Clara needed to learn to listen without fear, to interpret without judgment, to become part of something greater than the superficial accounts of the mansion's history. Clara began exploring on her own. During one of these explorations, she found a room partially hidden behind a movable bookcase in the library. Inside, there were files that no one had ever touched. Letters from people who had been in the mansion decades ago, describing their auditory experiences and inexplicable sensations. They all mentioned voices and invisible presences, but also spoke of a feeling of connection and enlarged perception that no one could explain. The young woman realized that Whitmore Manor was not just a prison or a place of family secrets. It was a convergence point for extreme human experiences, some truly dangerous, others incomprehensibly profound. With this understanding, Clara began to act more decisively. She stopped hiding in the dark hallways, she stopped fearing the whispers, and he began to interact with them. First timidly, then with growing confidence, she realized that some voices responded when she spoke or moved in a specific way. It was almost as if the mansion was testing her, or selecting who was fit to hear the truth without being consumed by it. A critical point occurred when Clara decided to confront Samuel directly through the bars of his cell. "Why are they keeping me here?" she asked. Samuel stared intently at her. "To protect the world from what I could do, and to protect myself from what they don't understand. But you have the ability to listen without getting lost. You're on the edge of something no one else has achieved." Clara sensed the tension in every word he spoke. She realized that by confronting the terror of the mansion, her fear was beginning to be replaced by clarity and purpose. "So you're not just a victim," she said slowly. "You're a part of this story that no one dares to understand." Samuel nodded. "Exactly. And now you know. You see the complexity." Over time, Clara began to devise a plan. It wasn't just about documenting files or understanding voices. It was about confronting what the mansion truly concealed. Each discovery, each step through the corridors, each conversation with Daniel and Margaret transformed her perception and strengthened her courage. She began to notice patterns in her family's actions, in Samuel's reactions, in their own voices. There was a hidden logic, the logic that explained years of silencing, confinement, and disappearance. And by understanding this logic, Clara felt she could interact with it without being consumed, a feat no one had ever accomplished before. The mansion, with all its dark corridors and unsettling voices, began to reveal itself to her, no longer as a place of fear, but as an enigma that could be decoded. She was growing up surrounded by terror, not as a victim, but as someone who could now understand and confront what the Whitmore family had hidden for generations. In the days that followed Clara's transformation, the Whitmore mansion seemed to react to her presence in an unexpected way. The corridors that once whispered secrets now seemed to guide her, as if recognizing that she finally had the capacity to understand what was hidden. But the tension never lessened. On the contrary, each discovery brought her closer to something that not even Arthur Whitmore or Margaret could fully control. Clara began to organize what she had learned. Old documents, photographs, accounts, and voices in the hallways. Everything converged on a single point: the east wing of the house. She knew that soon she would have to confront Samuel definitively, not only to understand his story, but to face the consequences of her own courage. Daniel began to collaborate more openly. He showed her secret passages that connected the east wing to the library and the main bedrooms, allowing Clara to move around more safely. During one of these explorations, Daniel finally spoke about something that had always kept her on edge. "Samuel isn't the only one. There are others," he said, looking at Clara gravely. "People no one has ever mentioned, but you need to be prepared. When everything comes to light, there will be no turning back." Margaret, for her part, continued to provide important information, but in an enigmatic way. She said little, but her gestures, glances, and subtle indications helped Clara understand patterns that weren't written in any document. Her interactions with Daniel created a network of support, but also of tension. Clara began to realize that every decision made in the mansion could trigger unexpected reactions. Meanwhile, the mansion itself seemed to anticipate events. Doors that had once been silent now creaked at night, signs that something was stirring behind the walls. The whispers in the hallways intensified. They were no longer just indistinct voices. Some now formed clear, incomplete words, but enough to indicate that something extraordinary was about to happen. Clara studied every detail of the east wing, taking notes on each door, each room, and each object. She realized that the layout of the cells and corridors was not random. There was a logic, an intention carefully planned by generations of Whitmore. With each discovery, the scene became more complex and the tension more palpable. She knew that any wrong move could have irreversible consequences. On a particularly quiet night, Clara decided to confront Arthur about what would really happen if Samuel were released. He stood firm, but for the first time his composure seemed to waver. "Samuel wasn't placed here by chance," he said. "Releasing him would mean allowing forces you don't understand to manifest again. But at the same time, there's something he needs to reveal. And you," he paused, looking directly into Clara's eyes, "are in a position to witness all of it." Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. She knew she was about to witness something that would change the perception of the entire history of the mansion. Every corridor, every door, every object accumulated enough tension to transform that night into a point of no return. The following morning, Clara walked down the main corridor to the east wing. The voices were no longer just whispers. They were warnings, advice, alerts, and sometimes pleas. The atmosphere was charged with an energy that seemed to concentrate decades of secrets, fears, and family conflicts. Each step she took reinforced the feeling that the climax was near. Samuel was still behind the main door of the east wing, waiting. Arthur, Daniel, and Margaret watched from strategic points, alert to any movement. Clara took a deep breath, adjusted her flashlight, and felt for the first time that the history of the mansion was about to be revealed, completely and irreversibly. Time seemed to slow down. Every corridor, every door, every whisper aligned itself for the same moment, the final confrontation. Clara realized that, to face what was to come, courage alone was not enough. It was necessary to understand the logic of the voices, the disappearances, and the mansion itself. The tension reached an almost unbearable point when she placed her hand on Samuel's cell door. There was no turning back. Everyone in the mansion knew what would happen next. Even the voices in the hallways seemed to hold their breath, awaiting the imminent outcome. Clara placed her hand on Samuel's cell door, feeling the metallic cold beneath her fingers. The corridor of the east wing seemed to hold its breath along with her. Voices in the hallways echoed like a crowd of anxious murmurs, each whisper laden with expectation, fear, and urgency. Samuel watched her with eyes that reflected decades of suffering, anger, and disdain. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice hoarse and heavy with intensity. Clara swallowed hard, feeling her heart race. It wasn't just the tension of the moment. It was the awareness that everything she had discovered was about to become reality. She nodded firmly. With a metallic click, she turned the lock and pushed the door open slowly. The creak echoed down the hallway like a warning. Samuel emerged from the darkness, thin, but with a presence that seemed to dominate the space. For a moment, Clara felt the entire mansion leaning toward them, as if awaiting the unfolding of that confrontation. Arthur took a few steps forward, his expression stern but full of tension. Daniel and Margaret remained close, attentive to his every move. The distance between Clara and Samuel seemed smaller than it had ever been, burdened with decades of untold history. "Samuel," Arthur began, his voice firm, but with a hint of uncertainty, "you know we can't allow the truth to be spread." "Really?" Samuel laughed, weakly but penetratingly. "You call what is preservation prison, but what you preserve is not just security. It's a lie. You lie to yourselves and to the world." The hallway seemed to tremble with the intensity of the words. The voices Clara had heard in recent days mingled with the sound of Samuel's own words, creating an almost physical cacophony, as if the mansion itself were protesting. Clara realized at that moment that the only way to end that cycle was to act. There was no more observation, no more hesitation. The truth needed to emerge, and she was the means. "I want to hear it," Clara said firmly, looking Samuel in the eyes. "I want to know everything." Samuel smiled slightly, a smile that mixed relief and disdain. "Then prepare yourselves, because the truth is deeper and darker than any of you imagine." He began to speak, describing events that Clara could only have imagined before, the people who had disappeared, the secrets the Whitmore family had kept for generations, and the complex web of manipulation, protection, and fear that shaped every corridor, every cell, and every action of the family. As Samuel spoke, Clara sensed a change in the air. Voices in the hallways began to articulate themselves. Some now formed clear sentences. Others repeated isolated words. Liberation, the truth. Finally, Clara realized that the mansion was responding to the revelation. The energy accumulated over decades of silence and fear was being released. Every old door creaked. Every corridor seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the unveiled history. Arthur tried to interrupt Samuel, but each of his words seemed to lose its force in the face of the emerging clarity. Daniel looked at Clara with a mixture of fear and respect. Margaret maintained a firm posture, but the tension in her eyes showed that the impact of the revelation was inevitable. When Samuel finally finished, Clara felt as if the air had been sucked from the hallway. The silence that followed was absolute, intense, almost palpable. The mansion was calm, but a calm laden with meaning. The truth was now before them. Clara took a deep breath and looked at Samuel. "So that's it, the whole story. The whole truth." "Not all," Samuel said somberly, "but enough to change everything." At that moment, Clara realized that the climax wasn't just the discovery of the truth, but the moment when each character confronted their own choices, fears, and responsibilities. Samuel, Arthur, Margaret, Daniel, and even herself were facing the consequences of decades of secrets and silent decisions. The voices in the hallways finally quieted down, leaving a deep and unsettling echo, as if the mansion itself were breathing, now freed from the accumulated tension. Clara felt that something inside her had changed forever. There was no going back to where she had arrived. She knew that the history of Whitmore Manor would not be forgotten, and that she herself would bear the marks of that climax for the rest of her life. But for the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope. The truth, however painful, had finally emerged from the shadows. The East Wing hallway remained silent after the intensity of the climax. The voices that for decades had whispered mysteries and fears finally ceased, leaving only the distant echo of what Whitmore Manor had once been. Clara took a deep breath, realizing that the truth, though painful and macabre, was now clear to all who had witnessed that moment. Arthur Whitmore stood by the cell door, motionless, but visibly dejected. For the first time, his expression didn't show authoritarian firmness, but rather an awareness of the weight of his decisions. Every action, every isolation, every secret kept for decades had converged on this point. He didn't need to say anything more. His expression said it all. Daniel approached Clara silently, offering support. His demeanor had changed since the beginning of the story. From apprehensive and distant, he had become someone who understood the impact of what had happened and recognized Clara's courage in facing everything. Margaret, for her part, observed every detail with attentive eyes, aware that the mansion would never be the same after the revelation. Samuel, still in his cell, looked at Clara with a gaze that mixed satisfaction and resentment. He finally understood that, even partially freed by Clara's courage in hearing the truth, the world outside would never be ready for everything he knew. Still, there was a sense of relief. Decades of isolation and silence now carried a meaning that transcended fear, the preservation of a complex, albeit dark, history. Clara walked down the East Wing corridor one last time. The walls, once oppressive, now seemed less threatening. Each room, each iron door, each scratch mark on the concrete told a story of suffering, secrets, and human complexity. She understood that the mansion was not merely a physical space, but a reflection of human decisions. Courage, fear, manipulation, and redemption intertwined over decades of existence. She realized that Whitmore Manor was not just a place of terror, but a space of learning. A place that tested limits, revealed truths, and confronted each individual with the essence of what they carried within themselves. Clara finally understood that her own transformation was complete. The initial fear had transformed into understanding and determination. Arthur, Margaret, and Daniel remained silent, knowing that the balance of the mansion had shifted. Samuel returned to his cell, but now with a look that mixed acceptance and defiance. The mansion itself seemed to breathe, as if it had absorbed the energy of truth and was now at relative peace. Clara knew that nothing could erase the recent events, but something had changed. The Whitmore family's story would no longer be hidden. The secrets were now before all who dared to face what was once feared. She took a deep breath, feeling that, despite all the darkness and suffering, a thread of hope had emerged, a thread that could connect past, present, and future in a more human and understandable way. Terror and mystery would remain, but Clara knew that with courage and attentiveness, it was possible to confront even the most macabre secrets and find, even in the shadows, fragments of truth and meaning. Months later, Clara visited Whitmore Manor only occasionally, now as a conscious observer of its dark past and the hidden stories the house held. Samuel remained in the East Wing, but his gaze had changed. Less hatred, more reflection on decades of choices and consequences. Arthur Whitmore continued to oversee the house, but without the weight of absolute secrecy. The confrontation with the truth had transformed his perception. Daniel and Margaret resumed their routines, more attentive to the human complexities that the mansion had revealed, understanding that some shadows do not completely dissipate, but can be managed with awareness. Clara, for her part, carried with her the experience that had forever changed her view of courage, truth, and responsibility. The mansion, still imposing, silent, and mysterious, continued to hold its whispers, but now at least they were not destined to be ignored. If you felt drawn into this story and the mysteries of Whitmore Manor, share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us which moment impacted you the most, which character sparked your curiosity, or which secret of the house you would have tackled first. Don't forget to like and share the story with friends who enjoy suspense, horror, and macabre narratives. The more people who delve into this dark universe, the more the voice of the corridors that Clara heard will resonate. And if you want to continue exploring previously unknown secrets and mysteries, subscribe so you don't miss the upcoming stories that reveal what lies behind seemingly ordinary yet profoundly dark places.